$3 billion worth of gold. That's what international mining companies had extracted from Burkina Faso's soil, while paying less than 10% to the local government. When Ibrahim Traoré called them to his first presidential meeting, they thought it was just another negotiation. They were wrong. At 37 years old, this young captain was about to challenge an entire system that had exploited Africa for over a century. What happened in those boardrooms would shock the global mining industry and change the course of a continent forever. The fluorescent lights in the presidential archive cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls as Ibrahim Traoré worked through his third consecutive night. Outside, Ouagadougou slept under a blanket of humid African air, but inside this windowless room, a revolution was being born one document at a time. His fingers, stained with ink from handling decades-old contracts, traced the numbers that would have made any economist weep. File after file revealed the systematic theft that had been disguised as legitimate business for over half a century. Carmony Mining Company's ledger lay open before him, its pages yellowed with age but its message crystal clear. $847 million in extracted gold over the past year alone. Their tax contribution to Burkina Faso? A mere $23 million. Ibrahim's calculator confirmed what his instincts had suspected. They were paying less than 3% of their revenue to the country whose soil had made them rich. How is this possible? He whispered to the empty room, his voice echoing off filing cabinets that contained the evidence of his nation's exploitation. Canadian Aurora Resources documentation told an even more shocking story. Production value, $1.2 billion annually. Local population's share, 3.7%. The mathematical brutality was breathtaking in its simplicity. But it was the Française de Mines contract that made Ibrahim's hands tremble with rage. A 45-year concession agreement, signed in 1978 when Burkina Faso was barely finding its feet as an independent nation. Annual rent paid to the government, $2.8 million. For comparison, the same company paid more than that amount in monthly parking fees for their Paris headquarters. Marcus Cabaret, his chief advisor and childhood friend, found Ibrahim at 4 a.m. surrounded by towers of documents and empty coffee cups. Marcus had served alongside Ibrahim in the military, watching his friend rise through the ranks not through connections or politics, but through an unwavering commitment to his country and its people. "Effendim," Marcus said softly, using the respectful title that felt natural despite their friendship. "You've been here for 3 days. You need rest." Ibrahim looked up, his eyes red with exhaustion but burning with purpose. "Marcus, do you know what $3 billion could build in our country?" Marcus shook his head, though he suspected the answer would change everything. 50 hospitals with modern equipment, 200 schools with libraries and laboratories, 1,000 kilometers of paved roads connecting every village to every city, water systems for 10 million people. Ibrahim's voice grew stronger with each statistic. "Instead, this money sits in bank accounts in London, Toronto, and Paris." He pulled out a calculator and began typing with deliberate precision. $3 billion stolen over 5 years. 60% of our population lives on less than $2 per day. This isn't just business, Marcus. This is economic warfare. Marcus studied his friend's face and recognized the expression he'd seen before. During their military academy days when Ibrahim would spend entire nights planning training exercises that others deemed impossible. During their early deployments when he'd refused to accept mission parameters that put civilians at risk. It was the look of a man who had found his battlefield. "What are you planning?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer would reshape everything they thought they knew about their country's future. Ibrahim closed the final file and stood up, his spine straightening with military precision. "Tomorrow, I'm calling meetings with every international mining company operating in Burkina Faso. They think they're coming to negotiate with another compliant African leader who will accept whatever crumbs they offer." He walked to the window and looked out at the city that would soon wake to a new reality. They're wrong. But while Ibrahim prepared for what he knew would be the most important day of his presidency, thousands of miles away in Dubai, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. The 47th floor of the Burj Al Arab commanded a view that stretched from the gleaming towers of downtown Dubai to the endless blue of the Persian Gulf. But the three figures gathered around the mahogany conference table weren't interested in sightseeing. They were here to discuss the Ibrahim Traoré problem. David Richardson paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his Seville row suit impeccable despite the tension radiating from his every movement. At 45, he had spent 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder at Carmony Mining, transforming himself from a geology graduate into one of the most powerful men in the international mining industry. His Harvard MBA and his ruthless business acumen had made him rich, but it was his ability to handle difficult African governments that had made him indispensable. "Gentlemen, lady," he began, his British accent carrying the authority of someone who had never been told no. "We have a situation developing in Burkina Faso. This young captain, Ibrahim Traoré, has requested meetings with all three of our companies." Across the table, Jennifer Walsh scrolled through intelligence reports on her tablet, her expression betraying nothing. At 52, the Canadian Aurora Resources general manager had built her reputation on her ability to extract maximum profit from minimum investment. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her ice-blue eyes had intimidated mining ministers across 3 continents. "David, you're overreacting," she said without looking up from her screen. "He's a 22-year-old soldier who stumbled into power during a coup. A few million in the right pockets, some promises about infrastructure development, and he'll fall in line like all the others." But the man at the head of the table remained silent, his fingers steepled as he absorbed every word. Philippe Dubois wasn't just the Africa Operations Director for Française des Mines. He was the shadow architect of France's post-colonial economic policy across the continent. His silver hair and elegant bearing masked a brilliant mind that had orchestrated resource extraction strategies from Senegal to Chad for over 3 decades. "You're both underestimating the situation," Dubois said finally, his French accent adding gravity to words that seemed to carry the weight of history. "This young man isn't typical. In 6 months, he's restructured the military, renegotiated security partnerships, and shown a level of strategic thinking that frankly concerns Paris." Richardson stopped pacing and turned to face Dubois. "Philippe, I respect your experience, but we have significant advantages here. 45-year concession agreements backed by international arbitration. World Bank guarantees on our investments. The entire ECOWAS economic framework supports our operations." And, Walsh added, finally looking up from her tablet, "If he's smart, he'll recognize that cooperation is far more profitable than confrontation. The alternative is economic isolation, and no African leader survives that for long." Dubois opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a classified document marked with the seal of the French Republic. "Operation Sahel Control," he said quietly. "If diplomatic solutions prove inadequate, we have other tools at our disposal. ECOWAS pressure, World Bank credit freezes, European Union sanctions packages." Richardson raised an eyebrow. "And if economic pressure isn't sufficient?" Dubois's smile was thin and cold. "Then we consider whether Captain Traoré's government is providing adequate stability for international investment. History shows that unstable governments don't last long in this region." The implications hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. All 3 had been through this dance before. In Ghana, when the government had attempted to renegotiate gold mining royalties. In Mali, when lithium extraction rights had been questioned. In Niger, when uranium export taxes had been proposed. The formula was well established. Economic pressure first, political destabilization if necessary, regime change as a last resort. "How long do we give him?" Walsh asked, her tone suggesting the outcome was already predetermined. "The meetings are scheduled for tomorrow," Richardson replied. "I'll present our standard package, modest increases in local hiring, some community development funds, perhaps a small bump in royalty payments. If he's reasonable, this whole thing goes away quietly." Dubois nodded approvingly. "And if he's not reasonable?" "Then we remind him that Burkina Faso is a landlocked country surrounded by allies who understand the importance of international economic cooperation." But as the Dubai meeting concluded with handshakes and confident predictions, none of the 3 realized that Ibrahim Traoré was already several moves ahead of them. While they planned to manage him like just another African leader, he was preparing to fundamentally alter the rules of the game they thought they controlled. That same night, as Richardson flew back to London, Walsh returned to Toronto, and Dubois caught a red-eye to Paris. Ibrahim Traoré was making a phone call that would change everything. At 7:30 a.m. London time, David Richardson's personal phone rang in his Belgravia townhouse. He was enjoying his morning Earl Grey tea and scanning the Financial Times when he saw the caller ID, +226 253. The Burkina Faso Presidential Palace. "Mr. Richardson, this is Ibrahim Traoré. I hope I'm not calling too early." Richardson nearly choked on his tea. In 20 years of African operations, no government leader had ever called him directly, especially not at this hour. "Mr. President, what an unexpected pleasure. How can I assist you? I wanted to speak with you before our meeting today. Last night, I took a drive to your Kudugu mining facility. Very impressive operation. Richardson's hand tightened on the phone. The Kudugu mine was their most productive site, and it wasn't open to casual visits. Sir, I hope our security team was helpful. Oh, I didn't go through your security team, Ibrahim said casually. I find it's better to see operations as they really are, don't you? A chill ran down Richardson's spine. Mr. President, I'm not sure I understand. I watched your transport trucks loading gold-bearing or for shipment. Interesting that none of them bore Burkina Faso customs seals. According to your concession agreement, all mineral exports should be processed through our government oversight systems. Richardson's mind raced. The customs bypass was legal, technically, covered by exemptions negotiated decades ago when African governments were more cooperative. But having a head of state personally observe it was deeply concerning. Sir, our shipping procedures comply fully with all existing agreements. Mr. Richardson, Ibrahim's voice carried a new edge. I'm not questioning the legality of your operations. I'm questioning their fairness. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by Richardson's increasingly rapid breathing. During our meeting today, I'll be presenting some new proposals for our partnership, Ibrahim continued. I encourage you to listen with an open mind, because this isn't just a business negotiation, Mr. Richardson. This is a conversation about the future of my country. Before Richardson could respond, the line went dead. Within minutes, Richardson was on an encrypted conference call with Walsh and Du Bois, his carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time in years. This is escalating faster than we anticipated, he said. Traoré just called me personally. He's been conducting surveillance on our operations. Walsh's voice carried across the connection from Toronto. Surveillance? That's borderline hostile action. Worse, Richardson continued. He specifically mentioned our customs arrangements. That information isn't supposed to be accessible to local government officials. Du Bois's response was immediate and chilling. Then we accelerate our timeline. Operation Sahel Control goes active today. I'm making calls to Abidjan, Accra, and Niamey. By tonight, Ibrahim Traoré will understand the consequences of challenging established international partnerships. But as the three mining executives planned their counterstrike, Ibrahim Traoré was already implementing the most audacious strategy any African leader had attempted in decades. The presidential palace conference room in Ouagadougou had witnessed many historic moments since Burkina Faso's independence, but nothing quite like what unfolded at 9 a.m. that Tuesday morning. The mahogany table, polished to mirror brightness, reflected the tension that filled the air like electricity before a storm. David Richardson entered with an entourage that looked more like an occupation force than a business delegation. 3 attorneys from international law firms, 2 security consultants, and a risk assessment specialist. Their briefcases were worth more than most Burkinabe made in a year, and their confidence radiated the comfortable arrogance of men who had never lost a negotiation in Africa. Ibrahim Traoré sat alone on the opposite side of the table, with only Marcus Cabaret beside him and a simple manila folder in front of him. The contrast was so stark it was almost comical until the talking began. Mr. President, Richardson began with the smooth confidence of a man reading from a well-rehearsed script. Carmony Mining is delighted to continue our 45-year partnership with Burkina Faso. We're proud of our contribution to your economy. $50 million annually in taxes and fees, direct employment for over 3,000 nationals, and indirect economic benefits that support tens of thousands of families. Ibrahim listened without expression, occasionally making notes on a small pad. When Richardson finished his opening statement, the room fell silent for nearly 30 seconds. Mr. Richardson, Ibrahim said finally, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority, are these numbers accurate? $50 million in total payments. Absolutely, sir. Every payment made in strict accordance with our negotiated agreements. Ibrahim opened his manila folder and withdrew a single document. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Richardson's side. This is your company's internal production report for last fiscal year. It shows gold extraction valued at $1.7 billion. Your $50 million represents 2.9% of that total. Richardson glanced at the document and his face went pale. Mr. President, I'm not sure how you obtained internal company documents, but the source isn't important, Ibrahim interrupted quietly. The numbers are what matter. Would you agree that 2.9% is a reasonable share for the country providing the gold, the land, the water, and the labor force? One of Richardson's attorneys leaned forward. Sir, these agreements were negotiated in good faith with your predecessor government. International law recognizes the sanctity of such contracts. Ibrahim turned his attention to the lawyer with the patience of a teacher addressing a confused student. International law also recognizes the sovereign right of nations to renegotiate extractive industry agreements when circumstances change. Wouldn't you agree that a change from a military dictatorship to a democratically accountable government constitutes changed circumstances? The lawyer had no immediate response. Ibrahim stood and walked to a wall map of Burkina Faso, its surface dotted with colored pins marking mining concessions. Gentlemen, I want to show you something. Each red pin represents a foreign-owned mining operation. Each generates hundreds of millions in revenue annually. Together, they extract resources worth over $8 billion per year from our soil. He traced his finger along the map's borders. This wealth leaves our country and travels to shareholders in London, Toronto, Paris, Johannesburg. Meanwhile, 60% of our people live on less than $2 per day. Does this seem like a sustainable partnership to you? Richardson found his voice. Mr. President, mining operations require enormous capital investment, technological expertise, and international market access that we couldn't possibly understand. Ibrahim finished with a slight smile. Yes, I've heard that argument before. It's the same argument Europeans used to justify colonialism for centuries. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Here's what I propose, Ibrahim continued, returning to his seat. Effective immediately, Burkina Faso will receive 50% of gross revenue from all gold extraction operations within our borders. Alternatively, we'll exercise our sovereign right to nationalize mining operations and develop partnerships with countries that offer more equitable terms. Richardson shot to his feet. This is highway robbery. You can't arbitrarily void international agreements. The World Bank, the International Court of Arbitration, the entire international business community will respect our sovereignty, Ibrahim said calmly, or find themselves explaining to the global community why a 22-year-old African leader understands resource economics better than they do. One of Richardson's security consultants whispered something in his ear. Richardson nodded grimly. Mr. President, I think you're underestimating the complexity of your position. Burkina Faso is a landlocked country dependent on regional economic cooperation. Your neighbors may not appreciate destabilizing actions that threaten regional investment climate. Ibrahim's smile was sharp as a blade. Mr. Richardson, are you threatening my country? I'm simply observing geopolitical realities. Then let me share a reality with you. I've already spoken with mining companies from China, India, and Brazil. They find our proposed terms not only acceptable but generous compared to what they pay elsewhere in the world. The room went silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of Ouagadougou traffic. I'm giving you 48 hours to consider our proposal, Ibrahim said, standing and walking toward the door. Your answer will determine whether Carmony Mining has a future in Burkina Faso. As Richardson and his delegation filed out of the palace, he made 2 phone calls, one to his board of directors in London and one to Philippe Dubois in Paris. It's worse than we thought, he told Dubois. This isn't just about money. He's trying to fundamentally restructure the entire relationship. Then we proceed to phase 2, Dubois replied. By tomorrow, President Traoré will understand what happens when African leaders forget their place in the global economy. But Ibrahim Traoré had spent years studying asymmetric warfare, and he understood something that Richardson and Dubois had overlooked. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one your enemy expects you to use. At 11 p.m. that night, every radio and television station in Burkina Faso carried the same unprecedented broadcast. Ibrahim Traoré sat at a simple desk in the presidential palace, his military uniform immaculate, a small Burkina Faso flag positioned behind his left shoulder. He looked directly into the camera with the calm confidence of a man who had already won a battle his enemies didn't yet realize they were fighting. Citizens of Burkina Faso, he began, his voice carrying across every village, every market, every household in the country. Tonight, I want to share with you some numbers that will change how you think about our nation's wealth. In living rooms across Ouagadougou, families gathered around radio sets and television screens. In rural villages, people crowded into community centers to listen on battery-powered radios. This was history being made in real time. For 60 years, international mining companies have extracted gold from our soil. The total value of that gold is $50 billion. The amount paid to our people is $2 billion. The numbers hit like physical blows. Gasps and angry murmurs rippled through watching crowds. To put this in perspective, with just the money we should have received in the past 5 years, we could build a modern hospital in every province, a secondary school in every department, and provide clean water to every village in our country. In the poor neighborhoods of Ouagadougou, where families struggled to afford school fees and medical care, the revelation sparked immediate outrage. In rural areas where children walked hours to reach schools that lacked textbooks and electricity, the systematic theft became personal. Starting tomorrow, this changes. Our government will demand 50% of all mining revenues. This money will build hospitals, schools, and roads. It will provide scholarships for our children and health care for our elderly. It will ensure that Burkina Faso's wealth benefits Burkina Faso's people. Phone lines at radio stations exploded with callers expressing support. Social media platforms filled with messages of solidarity. But Ibrahim wasn't finished. Some powerful forces will try to stop us. They will pressure our neighbors, threaten our economy, and attempt to convince the world that asking for fair payment is unreasonable. They will do this because they've grown rich from our poverty, and they want to keep it that way. His voice grew stronger, more urgent. I need you to understand something. This fight isn't just about mining companies. It's about whether African countries will ever control their own resources, or whether we'll remain permanent suppliers of raw materials to other people's prosperity. In the Carmony mining compound at Koudougou, security guards watched nervously as crowds began gathering outside the gates. Similar scenes played out at Canadian Aurora and Française de Mines facilities across the country. If you believe that our gold should benefit our people, I ask you to show that support. Tomorrow morning, let every mining company in our country see that the people of Burkina Faso stand together. The broadcast ended with the national anthem, but across the country, nobody was ready to sleep. By dawn, over 300,000 people had assembled outside mining facilities throughout Burkina Faso. They carried signs reading "Our gold, our future, and fair share for our nation." The demonstrations were peaceful but unmistakable in their message. The people supported their president's demand for economic justice. In Dubai, David Richardson watched CNN's coverage of the crowds with growing alarm. In Toronto, Jennifer Walsh stared at her computer screen as aerial footage showed human rivers flowing around Canadian Aurora installations. In Paris, Philippe Dubois realized that Operation Sahel Control was about to encounter its first major obstacle, an aroused African population that finally understood exactly how much money had been stolen from them. How did this happen? Richardson demanded during an emergency conference call. How did he mobilize this many people this quickly? Because, Dubois said grimly, he told them the truth. And the truth is that we've been robbing them blind for decades. The revelation was about to get much worse. 3 days after Ibrahim's broadcast, as international pressure mounted and regional leaders were pressured to isolate Burkina Faso economically, the young president made a move that stunned the global mining industry. Standing before assembled journalists in the palace press room, with representatives from BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, and major African media outlets present, Ibrahim announced that Burkina Faso had signed a comprehensive mining partnership with the People's Republic of China. Effective immediately, he declared, Chinese state-owned enterprises will develop new mining operations under a 60-40 revenue split, with 60% remaining in Burkina Faso. Additionally, China will invest $5 billion in infrastructure development, including hospitals, schools, roads, and renewable energy systems. The announcement sent shockwaves through Western capitals. In Washington, State Department officials scrambled to understand how they'd lost an entire country overnight. In Brussels, European Union bureaucrats drafted urgent position papers. In London, Paris, and Toronto, mining executives watched their stock prices plummet in real time. But the most devastating revelation came next. Furthermore, Ibrahim continued, our Chinese partners have agreed to provide the technological expertise and equipment necessary to develop domestic refining capabilities. Within 5 years, Burkina Faso will export finished gold products rather than raw ore, multiplying our revenue by a factor of 6. Richardson, watching from his London office, felt his world collapsing. For decades, the Western mining industry had maintained control by ensuring that African countries remained suppliers of unprocessed materials. Finished products were manufactured in Europe and North America, where the real profits lay. If Burkina Faso could refine its own gold, other African countries would inevitably follow suit. The dominoes began falling immediately. Mali's government announced it was reviewing its mining agreements with Western companies. Niger's president called for emergency consultations on uranium extraction terms. Ghana's parliament scheduled hearings on gold mining royalties. Within a week, Carmony mining stock had lost 40% of its value. Canadian Aurora Resources faced a revolt from shareholders demanding management changes. Française des Mines found itself defending accusations of neo-colonial exploitation in the French parliament. But the personal costs were even higher. David Richardson resigned from Carmony Mining under pressure from the board of directors. His golden parachute was worth millions, but his reputation was destroyed. Industry publications labeled him the man who lost Africa. Jennifer Walsh survived longer, but her strategy of aggressive resource extraction was suddenly viewed as a liability rather than an asset. Canadian Aurora's board eventually forced her retirement, ending a career built on the systematic impoverishment of African nations. Philippe Dubois faced the most serious consequences. French intelligence services launched an investigation into Operation Sahel Control, and Dubois found himself testifying before parliamentary committees about illegal destabilization efforts. His career ended not with golden parachutes but with criminal charges. 1 year after the confrontation that changed everything, Fortune magazine's cover story read, "The revolution will be digitized. How a 22-year-old president rewrote the rules of global resource extraction." The article detailed how Ibrahim Traoré's strategy had spread across Africa like wildfire. By year's end, 12 countries had renegotiated mining agreements using the Traoré model: transparent revenue sharing, domestic processing requirements, and infrastructure investment clauses. Western mining companies were forced to adapt or exit. Those that remained discovered that fair partnerships were actually more profitable than exploitative extraction, because stable governments and prosperous populations created better business environments than desperate poverty and political instability. But perhaps the most important change was psychological. A generation of young Africans had watched Ibrahim Traoré face down some of the world's most powerful corporations and win. They learned that Western dominance wasn't inevitable, that alternative partnerships were possible, and that courage backed by popular support could overcome any amount of institutional pressure. In his modest office in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré kept 2 photographs on his desk. One showed him as a young military cadet, full of idealistic dreams about serving his country. The other showed the first graduating class from the new University of Mining and Technology, funded by Burkina Faso's dramatically increased mineral revenues. Between those 2 images lay the story of how one man's refusal to accept the unacceptable had changed the destiny of a continent. Late at night, when the palace was quiet and the day's work was done, Ibrahim would sometimes stand on his balcony and look out over Ouagadougou's lights, thinking about the billions of dollars that had once flowed out of Africa's soil to enrich distant shareholders. Now that money stayed home, building schools where children learned in well-equipped classrooms, hospitals where families received world-class medical care, and roads that connected isolated villages to the global economy. The numbers that had once represented Africa's exploitation now told a different story, a story of justice, dignity, and the radical idea that a continent's wealth should benefit its own people. It was a revolution measured not in violence but in spreadsheets, not in territories conquered but in futures transformed. And it had all started with a young man who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon against an unjust system is simply refusing to cooperate with your own oppression. The fight wasn't over, would never be over, as long as powerful interests existed to challenge African sovereignty. But the rules had changed forever, and every young African leader who followed would know that alternatives existed to the old patterns of domination and submission. The age of extraction was ending. The age of partnership had begun. And it had been won by a 22-year-old who understood that the most dangerous person in any room is someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The gold still flowed from Burkina Faso's mines, but now it flowed toward hospitals and schools and universities where children learned that their resources belonged to them, their future was in their hands, and their dignity was not negotiable. That may have been the most valuable treasure of all.